Barron Trump stepped to the podium, expecting a routine exchange, but instead received a masterclass in political composure that would reshape his entire approach to public discourse. The cameras captured every moment as the young man faced off against Representative Jasmine Crockett in what became an unforgettable lesson in authentic leadership that would reverberate far beyond the walls of that auditorium. The atmosphere inside Detroit's Renaissance Center was electric with anticipation. The air felt heavy not with tension, but with expectation, as if everyone sensed something significant was about to unfold. This wasn't just another political forum. This was a nationally televised event designed to showcase emerging voices in American politics. The producers had carefully orchestrated this moment, knowing that putting rising stars together often created the kind of compelling television that dominated news cycles for weeks. Barron Trump, barely 19 and fresh from his debut on the conservative speaking circuit, had accepted the invitation despite warnings from family advisors, who knew these environments could be unpredictable. His team had briefed him extensively, preparing talking points and anticipating potential challenges. They wanted him to project confidence, authority, and the kind of political instincts that would establish him as a serious voice in conservative politics. What they didn't anticipate was how thoroughly unprepared he would be for what came next. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat composed on the panel, her expression calm but alert like a seasoned attorney preparing to cross-examine a hostile witness. The former Dallas prosecutor turned Texas lawmaker had built her reputation on refusing to back down from difficult conversations. Her track record spoke for itself: years of defending clients that others wouldn't touch, cases that required not just legal skill but moral courage. She wasn't here to play nice, she was here to speak truth regardless of who was listening or how uncomfortable it made them. The forum had been months in the planning, originally conceived as a bridge-building exercise between established lawmakers and the next generation of political voices. The moderators had prepared standard questions about policy priorities and legislative processes. They expected respectful disagreement, perhaps some spirited debate, but nothing that would fundamentally challenge the carefully managed format they had constructed. Barron had rehearsed his approach, extensively studying Crockett's voting record, her public statements, her background in criminal defense. His media team had coached him to be direct, provocative even. They wanted a moment that would trend across social platforms and cement his position as a rising conservative voice, willing to challenge the establishment regardless of party affiliation. The strategy seemed sound: create a viral moment that would generate headlines and position him as fearless and uncompromising. What they didn't anticipate was how thoroughly unprepared he would be for encountering someone whose entire career had been built on substance rather than style. Crockett had spent years in courtrooms where preparation mattered more than performance, where the stakes were measured in lives changed rather than likes accumulated. The young Trump cleared his throat and launched into his prepared statement, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never been truly challenged in a public setting. Congresswoman Crockett, I've studied your legal background and congressional record extensively, but I have to question whether turning every issue into a confrontation is really effective leadership. Sometimes it seems like you're more interested in generating controversy than creating solutions. Your approach feels more suited to social media than serious governance. The room fell silent in a way that felt different from the usual pause between speakers. This wasn't the respectful policy discussion the moderators had envisioned. Barron had essentially accused a sitting congresswoman of being performative on live television, questioning not just her methods, but her motives. The cameras tightened, their focus waiting for the explosive response that never came. Producers in the control room held their breath, expecting fireworks but receiving something far more powerful. Instead, Crockett simply looked at him with the patience of someone who had faced far more seasoned opponents in far more hostile environments. Her expression didn't change, didn't harden with anger or soften with condescension. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of experience without a trace of defensiveness. "Young man," she began slowly, deliberately, "the privilege of your position is showing in ways you probably don't even realize. You mistake passion for performance because you've never had to fight for anything that truly mattered beyond your own advancement. What followed wasn't a political takedown, it was an education, delivered with surgical precision." Crockett began, sharing stories from her legal career, representing children who had nowhere else to turn. She spoke of a 10-year-old client who had been handcuffed at school for asking to call his mother when he felt sick. She described sitting in courtrooms where judges questioned whether young black girls deserved the same presumption of innocence as their white peers. Her voice remained steady, controlled, but each word carried the weight of lived experience. These weren't abstract policy discussions, she continued. These were real children with real futures hanging in the balance. When you've sat with a mother whose son was shot reaching for his wallet, when you've held the hand of a grandmother who raised 5 grandchildren because their parents were lost to a system that criminalized poverty, then you can lecture me about tone and approach. You call it confrontation, she continued, her gaze never leaving his face. I call it refusing to be silent when systems fail the most vulnerable. When you've sat with families whose children won't come home because of preventable tragedies, when you've seen how quietly injustice operates, when no one is watching, then you can lecture me about tone. Until then, you're just another voice telling people to quiet down so you can stay comfortable. Barron tried to interject several times, his prepared rebuttals dying on his lips as he realized how inadequate they sounded against the substance of her response. This wasn't the heated exchange he had anticipated. There was no shouting, no personal attacks, just the steady presentation of facts wrapped in lived experience that made his talking points seem hollow and rehearsed. He had come prepared for a debate, but was receiving something far more valuable. A lesson in what real leadership looks like when it's tested by genuine adversity. The Congresswoman wasn't finished. She turned slightly to address the broader audience, while keeping Barron in her peripheral vision, ensuring that her words reached beyond their immediate exchange. We've created a culture where young people think they can walk into any room and demand respect without earning it, where confidence without competence is mistaken for leadership. Confidence without competence is just noise, and noise doesn't change lives or save communities or repair the damage done by decades of policy failures. The audience sat transfixed, no longer watching a typical political exchange, but witnessing genuine mentorship happening in real time on national television. Barron's expression had shifted from confident to contemplative, his body language changing as he processed words that cut through his prepared talking points like a blade through paper. The cameras caught every micro-expression, every moment of realization as his certainty began to crack. "I didn't come here to embarrass you, Crockett," said her tone softening slightly, but never losing its edge. "I came here to remind everyone watching that leadership isn't about who can speak the loudest or who has the most recognizable name or who can generate the most social media engagement. It's about who's willing to do the hard work when the cameras aren't rolling, when there's no applause, when the only reward is knowing you made someone's life a little bit better." The silence that followed felt different, heavier with possibility rather than tension. Barron stood quietly for several moments, his prepared responses abandoned as he grappled with something he hadn't expected, genuine wisdom delivered without malice. When he finally responded, his voice had lost its earlier bravado, replaced by something that sounded almost like humility. "I think I misunderstood what this conversation was supposed to be about," he said slowly. "You're absolutely right. I came here trying to prove something instead of trying to learn something. That was my mistake, and I can see now that it was a bigger mistake than I realized when I walked in here tonight." The admission sent ripples across social media before the segment even ended, but not in the way anyone had expected. Here was a young man with one of the most famous surnames in America publicly acknowledging that he had overreached, that his preparation had been insufficient, that his assumptions had been wrong. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't calculated, it was simply honest in a way that felt revolutionary in the current political climate. Crockett nodded approvingly, but without triumph. "That's growth," she said. "And growth is what we need more of in these spaces. Not people trying to win points or generate clips, but people willing to evolve their thinking when presented with new information. That's how democracy is supposed to work, through honest engagement with ideas that challenge us." The remainder of the forum proceeded with notably different energy. Questions became more thoughtful, exchanges more substantive. Barron participated, but with visible humility, asking questions instead of making statements, seeking understanding rather than advancing predetermined positions. The transformation was remarkable, to witness a public figure actually learning and growing in real time, rather than simply defending their initial position, regardless of new information. In the hours following the broadcast, the footage spread rapidly across digital platforms, but the response was unlike anything political observers had seen in recent memory. Unlike typical political confrontations, this moment resonated because it showed what productive discourse could look like when participants were willing to engage authentically. Comment sections, usually filled with partisan attacks, instead featured discussions about leadership maturity and the importance of listening to voices shaped by different experiences. Barron's response in the days that followed further surprised observers and political analysts who had expected him to retreat or attempt damage control. Rather than retreating or attempting to reframe the encounter, he doubled down on the lesson he had learned. In a video posted to his social media accounts, he thanked Crockett for her patience and announced his intention to spend more time learning from experienced leaders before presuming to challenge them on matters where his knowledge was clearly insufficient. The Congresswoman's office reported receiving thousands of messages from young people asking for guidance on public service, many citing the exchange as inspiration for their own political engagement. Teachers began using the exchange as a case study in constructive confrontation, showing how difficult conversations could be navigated with dignity and respect. The moment had transcended politics to become something more valuable, a template for how difficult conversations could be navigated with dignity. What made this encounter particularly significant was its demonstration that wisdom doesn't always come from the most credentialed voice in the room or the most famous name on the panel. Sometimes it comes from the person who has fought the hardest battles and emerged with both their principles and their humanity intact. Sometimes it comes from understanding that true strength lies not in never being wrong, but in being willing to learn when you are. Barron. Trump had walked into that forum expecting to make headlines and establish his political credentials. Instead, he made history by showing that the most powerful response to being humbled is not defensiveness or denial, but gratitude and genuine reflection. His willingness to absorb criticism and grow from it publicly offered a model for how public figures could handle accountability in an era when admitting error had become almost extinct in political discourse. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, had demonstrated that effective leadership doesn't require raising your voice or attacking your opponent personally. Sometimes the most devastating response is simply telling the truth with clarity and composure, letting facts and experience speak louder than rhetoric or partisan talking points. Her performance that evening became a masterclass in how to maintain authority while teaching rather than destroying. The lasting impact of their exchange extended far beyond the political sphere, reaching into classrooms, boardrooms, and family dinner tables across the country. It reminded viewers that meaningful dialogue requires participants who are willing to be changed by the conversation rather than simply waiting for their turn to speak. It showed that admitting error isn't weakness, but strength, and that real leadership often emerges in moments of unexpected vulnerability, when our assumptions are challenged by uncomfortable truths. In an era of performative politics and manufactured outrage, this genuine moment of human connection offered hope that Public discourse could be elevated beyond the usual talking points and tribal loyalties. Two people from vastly different backgrounds had found common ground not through agreement, but through mutual respect for truth and growth, demonstrating that authentic leadership transcends party lines and generational divides. The story of Barron. Trump and Jasmine Crockett became more than just another political clip destined to be forgotten in the next news cycle. It became a reminder that in a world hungry for authentic leadership, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is listen, learn, and publicly acknowledge when you have more growing to do. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't winning an argument, but opening yourself to the possibility that you might be wrong, and that being wrong might be the beginning of becoming right.